So Whitebook, welcome in my online home office. You are a philosopher and psychoanalyst, and you have studied in Berkeley. You are very familiar with the Frankfurt School, and you have received a PhD from the New School in Philosophy in 1977, and then you decided to become a practicing psychoanalyst. And you are currently on the faculty on the Columbia Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research, and you are the former director of its Psychoanalytic Studies program. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
You have written a book about Freud, which had been published with the translation of Elisabeth Vorspuhl by Klett-Cotta in Germany. And your biography about Freud is also a history of science, because you relate and explain the circumstances, the social and cultural background of an epoch where Freud lived his childhood. His ideas were radically opposite to the ideas of his epoch. Why it is so important to know the details of the origin and the childhood of the young Freud.
Well, to answer your question, I have to give you some background about the genesis of the project. When I was originally invited to write the book in English by Cambridge University Press, I wasn't sure whether the project made sense and whether the world really needed another biography of Sigmund Freud. So as a result, I had read the standard biographies by Peter Gay and Ernest Jones, for example, when I was a graduate student and a psychoanalytic candidate. And I hadn't really followed the biographical literature since then. Also, I hadn't while I'd been teaching Freud for many years, I hadn't gone back and systematically read a good deal of the standard edition in English, again, since I was a graduate student and a psychoanalytic candidate. So in trying to decide whether to take on this project and to try and figure out what my orientation would be, I went back and I read a good deal of the standard edition. And what struck me immediately was how the mother was, if not excluded, systematically sidelined or marginalized in Freud's thinking, not only in terms of his theory of development, in terms of psychoanalytic technique, and most obviously in terms of his theories of religion and civilization. So the question became, for me, the sort of hermeneutical question, the research question, was why was the mother, if not, again, missing, at least marginalized in his thinking? At the same time, there had been the field of Freud studies as an academic discipline had emerged in the interim since the time I had been a graduate student and a candidate. Mm-hmm. And also there had been the feminist critique of Freud and the rise of infant research, as well as a rapprochement between psychoanalysis and attachment theory. All of these things combine to make us much more sensitive to the early mother-infant relationship. Mm-hmm. And the Freud studies, the new historical, the scholarly studies of Freud's life had really investigated his first 3 years in Freiburg, which had not been emphasized by Jones and had not been emphasized by Gay. In fact, they had accepted Freud's own idealized version of what had happened, namely his tendency to portray his first 3 years as being ideal, of his having this unsurpassed relationship with this young loving mother who adored him, who referred to him famously as my golden Ziggy. And it turns out what the new research demonstrated, it can't be proven beyond a doubt, but which highly suggested was that his first 3 years had been quite traumatic, characterized by, and that far from being ideal, his relationship with his mother, Amelie, had been quite traumatic.
Yeah.
So I borrowed a thesis of Brager's that in order to deal with this traumatic, at least this traumatic early beginning, and indeed to disavow it, Freud had adopted this idealized picture of what had happened. And the consequence for this in his thinking was that he tended to minimize the significance of the early mother relationship. Mm-hmm. And this had consequences for his entire career.
Yeah. Your biography will help the reader to better understand the motivation of Freud. Your introduction sets the tone. It is the development of feministic critique of psychoanalysis, research about babies and new ways of the attachment theories, as new experiences with unclassical patients who has enlarged the instruments of psychoanalysis. All this allowed you to write a new biography about Freud, as you explained it yet, and it is also a book about these new theories.
I wouldn't say it was a book about these new theories. It was a book that was informed by these new theories. I mean, I had to ask myself why the standard biographies and the standard accounts of Freud's early experience had eluded the importance of the early mother and Freud's traumatic relationship to them. And to answer that question, I argued that biographies like Jones's and Gay's were written within a different hermeneutical horizon, one which hadn't yet been challenged by the feminist critique, one in which hadn't been informed by infant research and attachment theory, and one which ascribed to the classical psychoanalytic position that the father complex, the Oedipus complex, was the nuclear complex of the neurosis and civilization. So I argued that as opposed to the canonical biographies, we now occupied a different hermeneutical horizon informed by all these developments. So that when we went back and read his text, the absence of the mother became very clear to us, almost leapt off the page.
Mm-hmm. The former biographies did not pay attention very much to his mother. You already told this. Why Amalia Natterson, 20 years younger than her husband Jakob Freud, was neglected by other authors? And why does she explain us to understand better his son Sigmund? There have to be any reasons because why she has been neglected by the authors?
Well, it's as I was just trying to say, not only did the biographers like Gay and Jones, I mean, they were classically trained analysts, and they subscribed to the notion that the father complex and the Oedipus complex were the nuclear complex, as I said, of the neurosis and of civilization. Mm-hmm. So given their theoretical orientation, they tended to minimize the role of the early mother. And similarly, they accepted Freud's idealizing account of his early years, which denied his problematic relationship to Amelie.
Mm-hmm. Is it right, this remark in my article on the blog, I like very much your theoretical chapters. For example, in chapter 5, you explain the theory of the necessity to reduce tensions in the psychology constitution as Freud explained this 1895 in Entwurf einer Psychologie, which was only published in 1950. These theoretical chapters are important for your book, aren't they?
Yes, again, my book is informed by them, just as they're informed by the findings of the feminist psychoanalytic theorists, of the infant researchers, and of attachment theory. In particular, I draw extensively on the work of Hans Lowell. And he makes a distinction between the official Freud and the unofficial Freud. And the official Freud from the Project for Scientific Psychology, which you mentioned, all the way up until 1927, Freud subscribed to a discharge model of the psychic apparatus. The role of the psychic apparatus was to get rid of tension, to dispel tension. In his theoretical crisis in the 20s, he had to acknowledge the fact that there were pleasurable tensions. And that led him to introduce the notion of eros, where the psychic apparatus didn't aim primarily at discharging tensions, but rather at creating greater tensions and building up greater unities. And using the second theory of the drives and with the psychic apparatus, you get a much different picture than you do with the one he had originally articulated in the project.
Mm-hmm. The missing method.
But by the way, the project theory, the theory of the project, was really the resulted from his scientific training in the positive school. I mean, it was the Helmholtzian dimension of his thinking. He took the model. He even says, I'm going to present at the beginning of the project. He says, my intention is to present a inclusive, comprehensive theory of the psychic apparatus, which is explained purely in terms of the displacement of energy. So at that point, he sets out to complete or to fulfill the positivist program that he had originally internalized when he was working in Brugge's Institute.
Mm-hmm. May I ask you one precision? What can we learn from the interpretation of his works when we know better the traumata of the young Freud?
About Freud or in general? Mm-hmm. Was your question, what can we learn about Freud or what can we learn about in general?
What can we learn for the interpretation of his works when we know better his traumata, as the death of the little brother Julius and the conjugal problems of the parents? When we all know this, can we better interpret his works of Freud later?
Well, it helps us, following Breger, it helps us to explain why he had so much difficulty exploring the first 3 years of life and the pre-Oedipal dimension of psychic development. And this has systematic consequences for his thinking. As I said before, his theory of development, even his theory of technique, his clinical theory, and his theory of civilization. So once we realize the traumatic nature of his early years and use that to explain his difficulties and his distortions in explaining and in his attempts to explain early development to the extent that he did, the recognizing the trauma helps us to recognize the distortions and the omissions in his thinking and hopefully to correct them.
Mm-hmm. Freud said himself, the biographical truth doesn't exist. A biographer can avoid an idealization with regard to Leonardo da Vinci, a memory of his childhood from 1910. It is important to observe and to assess sexual behavior. You say that you don't want to out Freud, but the understanding of his sexual behavior can give us valuable information.
Well, two things about that. Practically every biographer who sets out to write a biography of Freud, and Adam Phillips is the most recent example, begins by saying Freud tells us biography is impossible. But they don't go ahead to explain why they believe they can write one which is accurate. It would seem that they quote something which would seem to make their project impossible, but they don't go on to explain why they're attempting a new one and why it's justified. And I argue, if you look at what Freud says there very carefully, is the reason biography is impossible is that we have an unavoidable tendency to idealize the subject. Now, my claim is, not only do I claim that Freud himself had a strong tendency towards idealization. You can see it in his relationship to Fliess, you can see it in his relationship to Jung, but that since Freud's time, precisely because we've learned so much about pre-Oedipal development and narcissism, we understand idealization much better than he did. Heinz Kohut made a big contribution here. And hopefully, because we understand idealization much better than he did, we're in a position not to avoid it completely, but to mitigate our idealizing tendencies when we write a biography. As to your second point, there's a quote which also from the Leonardo paper, where Freud says, there's no shame in admitting any of our sexual facts about our sexual lives or about our psychopathology. And to present a picture of somebody that excludes them, in fact, leaves you with a very uninteresting and dull picture of that individual. And he says, in fact, the greatest secret of nature is to explain how we take the psychosexual material, what Nietzsche referred to as the lowly, and how that can be transferred into great works like Leonardo's. Mm-hmm. That's, of course, what we meant by the process of sublimation.
In the same way, you explain the break with tradition when his father bought the Israelitic Bible of Ludwig Philippson. I have reproduced it on the blog. You can have a look in this Bible on my review article on the blog. Without the understanding of the religious education of the young Freud, the origin of his scientific interest cannot be explained.
Well, what I argue there is that his father, Jacob, was a transitional figure who, on the one hand, was raised by a rabbi and had a thoroughly religious upbringing, but on the other hand, partly because of his travels to the West and his exposure to modernity, wanted his son to become a modern Jew and to have all the advantages of modernity. So these conflicts within him, to on the one hand, transmit the Jewish tradition to his son, but also to want him to be a modern secular European, helped to explain the force field that Freud grew up in. And this is all encapsulated in the Philippson Bible, because on the one hand, the father, rather than presenting him the Torah, is presenting the Philippson Bible. And the Philippson Bible is a work of the science of Judaism and of Reformed Judaism. And while it contains the text and the stories, it objectifies them scientifically, has these extensive footnotes that go into the anthropology, even the foliage, the medications of the biblical stories. So while Freud is introduced into the biblical stories, especially the story of Moses, he's also introduced into this objectifying scientific attitude towards them, which leads from there to his interest in Feuerbach when he's a university student to the future of an illusion. I've lost your audio. I can't hear you. Still can.
Now?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Sorry.
Why it is so important to describe the passage from neurophysiology to the psychopathology, which happened to Freud during his studies in Paris where he met Jean-Martin Charcot?
Because if it had never occurred, he never would have become a psychoanalyst. When he went to Paris, he still considered himself a neurophysiologist. In fact, he went to Paris in order to dissect a large quantity of infants' brains to try and come up with some neurophysiological findings. That was why one of the reasons he went to Salpêtrière, because they had such a large supply of brains for him to dissect. But while he was there, he found himself fascinated by Charcot and by Charcot's approach to hysteria. And in the process, he tended to lose interest in neurophysiological and became interested in hysteria, which is to say psychopathology. And my thesis is that that was a transition from a neuropsychologist to a clinical psychologist, or with that transition, he in fact became a philosophical physician, somebody who thought he was going to make great discoveries by the exploration of psychopathology or the sick soul.
Mm-hmm.
That became his field of research, where he thought he could make his great discoveries.
Mm-hmm. For Freud, his friends Wilhelm Fliess, Joseph Breuer, and Carl Gustav Jung were very important colleagues, friends for him, who appreciated the dialogues with him. They was important for him to develop his ideas.
Well, in the book, I devote enormous attention both to Fliess and to Jung. And I argue that it was over a decade-long intense relationship with Fliess that Freud really went through this enormous personal transformation and created psychoanalysis. And my claim is that without this relationship to Fliess, psychoanalysis never would have been created. Freud experienced what Ellenberger has called a creative illness. During the 1890s, he was quite disturbed, both physically and psychologically, was using a lot of cocaine to try and deal with it. And it was through this proto-transference relationship to Fliess that he worked through his creative illness, and the result was the creation of psychoanalysis and the authorship of the interpretation of dreams.
The Great War changed his thinking. He wrote A Case of Paranoia Running counter to the psychoanalytic theory of the disease, was an introductory lectures of psychoanalysis where he developed the unconsciousness and the instinct drives. This was an important point for him.
It's funny, I've been reading Thoughts for the Time on War and Death in our current context with the virus epidemic. And in a way, I think, just as he said, death intruded itself on European consciousness as a result of World War I. I'm thinking about writing something about how it's intruding itself in our consciousness because of the virus. But that aside, my claim is that with the war, the concept of loss became central to Freud's thinking. I mean, he had suffered the loss of the break with Jung just before the war, but the massive losses of the First World War, which really created a hiatus in European civilization, forced the idea of loss on him. And you can understand a lot of the Morning and Melancholia was written during that period. And you can understand a lot of the works he wrote after the war, including Beyond the Pleasure Principle, as a response to these massive losses. Also, let me say one thing. During the war, he had a reduced practice. He saw fewer patients. And as consequently, he was able to spend much more time writing. And he went back to the more sociological themes that he had started to address in Totem and Taboo. And the work he did during that period could be seen as a transition to the great cultural writings that he wrote after the war.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned just the Beyond the Pleasure Principle of 1920. It seems to you to be one of the most scandalous work of him, and you are not afraid to repudiate some of Freud's results.
Scandalous isn't necessarily a negative term. Some of the great works of philosophy are quite, the most interesting, the most important works are quite scandalous. So if you take the work seriously, and try and understand what was motivating him, what he was up to there. I think engaging with beyond the pleasure principle can be quite productive. I try and disregard the metabiological arguments, which are of course very problematic, and try and interpret his idea of the death instinct in terms of the relationship with the early mother, which of course is a major theme of my book. And I try and reinterpret the death instinct in terms of his essay, which he wrote at the time on the three caskets.
Mhm. I have a last important point. The future of an illusion, 1927, is for Freud an occasion to remember this, that science could be fallible. Is this a way to resume also your approach to science? An absolute truth does not exist, but the research is always a struggle to approach the truth. And the case of Freud is a fine illustration of the struggle.
Yes, you know, as a philosopher, I started out my career partly in terms of the critique of positivism, and which I think in many ways in the wake of the Thomas Kuhn's work and the what's called the post-empirical philosophy of science, I think we became too skeptical about science. And I think, I mean, for good reasons. I mean, science was complicitous in sort of a technological culture. But I think now here in the States, with the assault on science by the conservatives and Trump, and where we see that the whole attack on science and expertise has gotten us into a mess. And in fact, the heroes that are emerging here, like Dr. Fauci, are experts and scientists, have to make us rethink our notion of science. And I think one of the assumptions that the critics, the sort of simplistic critics of science make, is that science is about certainty. Science is dogmatic. Science is about absolute knowledge. And for Freud, that certainly isn't the case. For Freud, science is based on the assumption that we have a propensity towards illusion. We have a propensity to deceive ourselves, and that we have to constantly struggle against that propensity. It doesn't mean that we're going to arrive at certainty. It means it's an ongoing process that has to be continuously taken up and reworked again. In this respect, I like a quote from Samuel Beckett, which could have been written by Karl Popper, namely that the idea is to try, to fail, to try again, and to fail better. So science is an open-ended project which doesn't aim at absolute knowledge, but sort of ongoing critique.
In some sentence,
I think that was Freud's deepest ethos.
Yeah. In some sentence, how would you resume today the importance of Freud's works to better understand a human being?
Well, for all the limitations of his work, you know, there's always a temptation to take down a great thinker. And it's actually, in many cases, quite easy to do. I mean, we know the arguments against Plato, we know the arguments against Kant, we know the glaring deficiencies in their thinking. And it's the same with Freud. By this point, all the arguments against them, most of us who have been involved with him can repeat in our sleep. But the thing about a great thinker is not their limitations. I think the striking thing is how far they go in spite of their limitations. And whatever difficulties there are with Freud's theory, I think he gave us the greatest resources for exploring human nature that we still have. And in fact, what I'm advocating is a critical appropriation of his theory, not a dogmatic adherence to it, but taking up his project, critiquing it, and using it to go beyond where he could go, given the limitations of his personality and the culture into which he was born.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I